Our first speaker is Dr. Lucy Whelan, who is a visiting fellow at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where she holds a Hanseatic scholarship from the Alfred Töpfer Foundation. And earlier this year, she completed her doctorate in art history at the University of Oxford. And she will be talking to us about Pierre Bonnard. The title of her talk is What the Painter Knows, Pierre Bonnard and the Experience of Time. So, welcome, Lucy.
I should have asked this before. Do I have to hold this? Yeah, I can't just put it here. No, it's all good. It's all good. If my puny arms give out, you can hold it. So I just wanted to begin a little bit more loosely. And in particular, I don't know who's read the article I circulated, and I just wanted to explain very briefly what this is, and then tell you a little bit about my research overall, and then I'll get stuck into the paper. So the article that you don't need to have read if you haven't, but is by Jean Clair, and it was written in 1984, and it's really the beginning of beginning to look at Bonnard in more interesting ways. Prior to that, people had written about him, but not so much. And Jean Clair's article interprets Bonnard as really painting his vision. Or to quote Claire, translating onto canvas the data of a vision that is physiologically real. I think it's a really interesting article. It's fascinating and it's right in many ways. I think Bonnard was interested in vision. But much of my work is disagreeing with it. So my research is, as a whole, I'm presenting just a section of it today, but as a whole, my research is trying to work out the ideas that Bonnard's works visually express, and to argue that they don't just represent, that his paintings don't just represent the world or show seeing, but they visualize an expansion of the structures of consciousness in various ways that have much more to do with memory and dream and imagination than they do with simply seeing, sort of straightforwardly. Such that we might characterize Bonnard's works as a kind of practical philosophical inquiry or thought experiment. It's much less camera-like and much more to do with reverie. So that's the kind of general product of my work on Bonnard, and what I want to present to you today comes from one chapter, really, which relates to the subject of time. So I'd like to begin by something that was new to me as of a week ago. I had an email in my inbox and found out that the Tate Modern in London, they never talk to the little person, do they? They just find out like everybody else in my email newsletter. The Tate Modern in London in January are opening an exhibition of Pierre Bonnard. It's going to be the first in the UK for 20 years. It follows a huge exhibition in 2016 at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris that also traveled to Madrid and San Francisco. But it's going to be a major show. And they promise that you will be captivated by this master of colour and composition who captured moments in time through his innovative style. The idea of Bonnard painting moments in time is one that forms the prevailing the foundation of prevailing interpretations of Bonnard's work. And this exhibition looks set to be no exception. You might have noticed it as a theme in the Jean Clair article that I sort of provided here as preliminary reading as well, and it also formed the title of a 2006 exhibition of Bonnard's work at the Musée Modern in Paris, titled Pierre Bonnard Suspending Time. Today, I'd like to argue, however, that Bonnard's works do present an understanding of time, but not one of the single fleeting moment. Instead, in his paintings and drawings, we find a certain knowledge about the time of daily experience, but it's a discovery of a more drawn-out, protracted time, expanded beyond just seeing something in an instant. So, first of all, I want to diverge for a moment and just ask, who was Pierre Bonnard? Because his critical fortune has been so mixed that not everybody, even people you might have expected to have heard of him, or know very much about him. So he was born in 1867 to a bourgeois family in the outer suburbs of Paris. His career stretched from a somewhat bohemian life in the fin de siècle, cheesy slide, sorry, but that's a painting and that's Bonnard, and it stretched to the south of France during the Second World War. As a young man, Bonnard took up studying law in Paris, hoping to paint in his spare time, but he quickly changed direction and enrolled at art schools. During the late 1880s and 1890s in Paris, he worked with his fellow artists of the self-styled Nabi Brotherhood, who were making decorative works, theatre set designs and posters. So this is a design for a fan by Bonnard with rabbits. And you might recognize Bonnard's famous 1891 poster for France Champagne. It's probably his most well-known work, ironically, despite the fact that it is his late works that I find more interesting and that I'm focusing on today. He knew wealthy clients. He had strong connections to the symbolist poet Stéphane Mallarmé and his circle, and to other avant-garde circles in Montmartre. But after around 1912, Bonnard gradually withdrew from the tumult of the capital to the provinces where his working routine begins to settle and his visual thinking seems to develop. The First World War seems to have had fairly small, if little, almost no effect on him, as indeed did the Second. He travelled a great deal around France and further abroad, but his work remained largely domestic in its subjects, repeatedly revisiting the same homely motifs. The home that he painted more than any other was a villa in Le Cannet, overlooking the Bay of Cannes in the south of France, where he started to work in the early 1920s and buying a villa there in 1927. From around 1920 then until his death in 1947, Bonnard painted landscapes and interiors, continually placing his wife, Mart, who he first met in 1893, within these settings. This is a photograph of Bonnard in that villa in 1944, taken by Henri Cartier-Bresson, and he's alone after Mart's death in 1942 and in difficult times during the occupation. This, incidentally, is the same room today. At the time this photo was taken, Bonnard was widely ranked among Picasso, Matisse, and Braque, and some of the most important artists and critics of his day thought him perhaps France's greatest living painter. Yet today, for various reasons, he remains somewhat of an outsider to sweeping art historical narratives about modernism's daring experiments, perhaps because, as I believe, his innovations have been widely underestimated. In particular, as I've mentioned, the orthodox idea that Bonnard simply captured photographic moments of what he saw around the house has something to answer for here. So let us return to the question of what more complex ideas about time are visually thought through in Bonnard's work. There's perhaps no better painting with which to begin this investigation than Bonnard's large canvas Noodle Laban. Finished over a period of years from 1936 to 1938, it radiates a dazzling chromatic splendor from edge to edge. Along its length lies Bonnard's wife Mart, who, like the artist, was then in her late 60s. To the knowing viewer, this is their bathroom in Le Bosquet, in Le Cannet, with windows facing south and west. Mart stretches out in the bathtub, immersed in water that is cloudy with the same brilliant colours that glow onto the square wall tiles above her. Coloured light is casting itself onto the wall, the edge of the bath, and across Mart's body in bands of colour that are resonant of sunlight in the midi, as the sun progresses through the sky over the course of a day. At the left, there's a fiery yellow brushed over with pale pink, redolent perhaps of the strong but rosy light of mornings in the midi in summer. To the right, this area, lilac blue, crossing her shins, perhaps a later, clearer morning light, evoking a cloudless sky. At the centre of the painting, this becomes this bright, harsh white light of the midday sun. And further up her body, colouring her torso and her head, is a golden orange, reminiscent of a warm and radiant late afternoon that gilds the sides of the bathtub and sends a scattering of golden floor tiles, sort of turning them into coins. Finally, barely touching the top of the bath and spreading through the bathwater is a purple that might suggest the last phase of a sunset. The sun's diurnal passage is signified here, its phases registered simultaneously along the length of this painting, mixing imprecisely in Bonnard's multiple layers of paint. Yet this painting's pictorial temporality is more protracted and complex than a single day, not least because Mart, whose elongated form lies along the work's centre like a temporal axis, is absorbed in private thoughts or daydreams. Within the private bourgeois space of the bathroom, her implied time is that of a languorous long duration. Sensing this enduring temporality, Some writers on Bonnard's late baignoires, as I'm terming the works in which Mart lies inactive in the bath, have seen their subject as an Ophelia-like figure who's lying in deathly eternity in a watery tomb. But while Mart's slack body seems in places to dissolve into the colourful water, her skin's actually pink and bright. Moreover, her endless temporality would only imply death. This endless temporality we get from her sense of reverie would only imply death according to a sort of linear model of time, the time of the clock, or an instantaneous, an idea of this being an instantaneous kind of vision. Alternatively, it could mean an experience duration that is extended but also out of time, being antilinear and complex, itself like a reverie, a duration that we can understand more precisely, perhaps, by drawing on contemporaneous ideas of the French philosopher Henri Bergson, whose books and lectures were immensely popular in France and abroad around the turn of the century, and to whose ideas I'll come back later. It's this temporality in Bonnard's works and his search for such an experience of time or time consciousness that I wish, through this painting, Noodle Laban, to explore now. But why on earth, given this resplendent, enduring temporality of paintings like Noodle Laban, have art historians always read Bonnard's works, and especially his late works, as presenting a single moment or a pause in time? It seems contrary to the visual evidence. The reason for this is primarily a written jotting that Bonnard made in a pocket diary that he carried with him for daily sketches and notes. The very year that Noodle Laban neared completion, 1936. This is the agenda. They're really tiny, they're lovely, they fit in his jacket pocket and he carries them with him all the time. And the line is l'œuvre d'art, un arrêt du temps, or the work of art, a stopping of time, written on the top left, followed by, underneath it, he added the more mocking remark, which translates as the fat fly who plays the kazoo, the merleton. It's a kind of reed pipe. Frequently cited and ever present for art historians as a constraint and stimulus when contemplating Bonnard's late works. Ooh. Oh, yeah, so... Sorry, that should have been read differently. This sentence, l'œuvre d'art, un arrêt du temps, has always been treated with art historians as kind of definitive. But, however, Bonnard's truncated agenda jottings weren't intended as definitive artist statements. Why should this scribbled note about l'œuvre d'art in 1936, not necessarily intended for the eyes of the public, refer to his own paintings when it directly contradicts the resplendent, enduring temporality of most of his paintings, and especially works like Noodle Laban? Bonnard rarely used the term l'œuvre in his recorded writings and statements about his work. Generally, he referred to la peinture or ma peinture. He used the word œuvre only really when referring to work by past masters, such as Boucher or Ingres. Indeed, the word œuvre suggests the work of a more established artistic tradition, the kind of magnificent, Salem-worthy painting that the young artist in Émile Zola's novel L'œuvre, translated into English as The Masterpiece, struggles to create. Bonnard's jotting from 1936, the work of art, a stopping of time, might therefore be understood not as a proclamation about his own work, but actually a noting down of what was widely considered an essential principle of the Beaux-Arts tradition, that the artistic œuvre shows a stopping of time. Asserted most notably by Diderot and his contemporary Gottfried Lessing in the 18th century. This principle asserted that the painter or sculptor had only an instant, and that the tableau must therefore represent a single unified moment that must be taken in by its viewer in a single glance or a coup d'oeil. In short, Bonnard here is perhaps inscribing a well-known principle of art, not necessarily his own thought. He might have been inscribing it perhaps to think about it, to question it, as much as to, here is what I think, here is what I do. And understanding Bonnard's remark in an alternative sense does raise the question of why he would write it in his agenda at all. But yeah, I think it's perhaps summarizing a custom and a constraint that his works are actually attempting to overcome. A custom which, for his generation, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was actually paramount in or was a custom that he actually wanted to distance himself from, along with so many other people in his generation. In particular, the strong association of photographic time and amateur photography, academic naturalism and Impressionism's naturalistic aspect, gave rise at this time to a new imperative to distinguish work from the instantaneous camera eye. So Impressionism's become a little bit unfashionable. Photography by the late 19th century was often seen as something for tourists. Artists didn't necessarily want to be, many artists really wanted to distinguish themselves from this every tourist has a snapshot camera now, we have to find something else to do. Now, art historians have looked mostly to futurist and cubist artists in discussing these are more photographic, like paintings, more instantaneous ones of the later 19th century, and these are futurist and cubist artists. And it's to futurist and cubist artists that art historians have more frequently looked to in discussing the modern temporalities that arose from this reaction against a photographic kind of seeing. But Bonnard's work offers a new paradigm of the temporality of experience, or time consciousness. It's possible that Bonnard never even considered the large painting Noodle Laban strictly finished. It was purchased by the French state in 1936, chosen by the Ville de Paris Committee for the allocation of funds on the occasion of the 1937 exhibition. It might have seemed complete to Raymond de Chaulier, director of the Petit Palais, who, if he ever saw the painting, might have thought it particularly appropriate for his exhibition, the patriotic Maître de l'Art Indépendant, for in plain sight it hides a French tricolour spread across the canvas, lighting up the bathroom tiles and Mart's body in iridescent colours. But if Chaulier had intended the painting to hang in the 1937 exhibition, it never actually made it there in time. After the exhibition opened in June, he was still requesting the painting from Bonnard, who delivered it later that year, but only on the proviso he could continue to work on it in the rooms of the Petit Palais. Catching up with the painter, his friend, Edouard Vuillard, in 1938, Bonnard declared he was finally getting his morale back for working, writing, "I've recommenced my baignoire." And by 1939, Chaulier, the director of the museum, assented to send the painting temporarily back again to Bonnard's studio on the pretext of its use in painting a second version of the work. Bonnard even famously, and this is, I think, more than a rumour, returned to galleries to retouch his paintings as they hung on the walls. Indeed, on one occasion, according to a characterful anecdote by Henri Cartier-Bresson, he was apprehended by security guards who took Bonnard to be some deluded fellow who thought he was a grand artist, pleading that they call the world-famous photographer to come and identify him. And Bonnard continued to paint two large versions of this composition over the years up to 1946, including Noodle Laban au Petit Chien. But it's not only in the drawn-out painterly process that the long temporality of Noodle Laban reveals itself. The single year that art historians often focus on in relation to Noodle Laban, 1936, and sometimes it's simply dated Noodle Laban, to 1936, not only fails to encompass Bonnard's almost open-ended, endless approach to painting, but also gives little idea of the decade or more behind the development of its composition. Bonnard's diaries from the years from 1927 to 1938 contain dozens of studies of Mart lying stretched out in the bath, of which one of the most redolent of the final... I'm only one-handed... of the final painting is from the 30th of March 1928. As in the 1936 composition, 1928, just in case I said 38. As in the 1936 composition, Mart's body stretches along the width of the image, up inside an up-tilted bath cropped at its end. And unusually for Bonnard's diary sketches, the surrounding tiled space commands almost as much attention as Mart's body, with the sparkle of its floor tiles so dominant here that are in the painting evoked by speckled shading. So there is a similarity to the painting in that sense as well. Another rough study, sketched on the back of an invoice from April 1927, composes the 1936 work almost exactly. This is a whole decade before the painting, right? The placement of the bath in the bathroom, the lozenge shape of the bath, the relative dimensions of the bath's interior as it splays to open to create a white enclosure for its subject, and Mart's elongated right leg crossing over her left. All this is replicated in the 1936 painting that wasn't to hang in the Musée d'Art Moderne until over a decade later. Other drawings scattered across the demarcated days of Bonnard's diaries also reveal alternative possibilities for the subject of Mart in the bath, showing various angles and viewing distances. In short, sorry, I'm repeating myself because I didn't realise it, Bonnard reflected on this subject for more than a decade. It's well known that Bonnard painted away from the subject. In fact, he once explained this as a tactic to reduce the physical presence of the object in all its sort of intense detail, which he found to be a distraction from what he called the starting point, that first seduction. That, he claimed, was why he painted alone in the studio. Bonnard's explanations of his own working process today provide further justification for the current consensus that he worked from memory, often implying a particular remembered scene, like he saw something, remembered it in that split second, and then he painted that sort of snapshot-like memory. Yet the gist of Bonnard's descriptions of his method was to underline the importance of preserving his subjective response to the motif on paper, not in his mind. When in 1937 a journalist asked if he had an extraordinary memory, he insisted, not at all, he said, and showed her his many, many rapid sketches covered in notes on colours. In short, when he sees a motif, when he sees his subject, he made sketches. And it's this that he copied. When he works away from the subject, he's working from these heavily and from multiple of them, made over long periods of time, and not just from a single memory. And indeed, of all the drawings relating to Noodle Laban, there's no reason to identify one sole original and simultaneously degrade the others to studies for composition. It would be an impossible task. Bonnard's artistic practice shows we shouldn't take any kind of claims to paint the first impression too literally. His discussions that have been heavily lent on, emphasising the importance of his subjective response, and were, I think, there to underline the importance of the subjectivity of that response and not the singularity of it. Certainly, the sunlight hues progressing across the canvas of Noodle Laban, representing the daily linear passage of time from dawn to sunset, belie any suggestion that Bonnard is painting a single first impression. But moreover, I think it would be too simplistic to imagine that these colours in Noodle Laban index the same single day as if Mart lay in the bath from morning to evening. Not just because of the sketches that go back decades in Bonnard's sketchbook, but because even in the MIDI, the light rarely, if ever, produces rich colours from start to finish. These colours instead denote years spent collecting the remarkable moments that might occur in the white-tiled light chamber of Bonnard's bathroom in Le Bosquet, brought together over the length of a painting. Noodle Laban is then founded on over a decade of encountering seductive, captivating visions of the visual world, and comprises many of them synthesized together. Nor do Bonnard's initial impressions of the motif in the form of sketches that informed Noodle Laban themselves depict one unified moment. Most of his encounters of Mart in the bathroom that he sketched in his agenda and elsewhere recognize the durational process of drawing. So looking at this page from 1937, from his agenda, from the 23rd and 24th of June, these two invite comparison between sketches of Mart drying herself and a more static Bannard pose. In the upper sketch, pencil lines are kind of chasing her moving body while she moves, attempting to kind of run over themselves and stopping midway in what reads like a knowingly futile attempt to render a moving form. Her left arm especially is this furious tangle of lines. So no sooner has the artist drawn a line than she's moved, right? Not that this was a problem for Bonnard. This was what he wanted. He actually required his models, who a couple of them clearly remember him asking them to keep moving, don't stay still. He sought out changing, moving subjects. Even the drawings of Mart lying flat and tranquil in the bath, such as the other drawing further down on this agenda page, still share aspects of this motion. Here we see, even when Mart is seemingly still, Here we see lines that echo one another, that cross over themselves imprecisely, pursuing the edge of her body. Her body appears unmoving, but lines denoting water currents you can sort of make out infuse the figure with life and gently make the whole thing undulate like something seen through water. It's more subtle, but this watery vision also conveys a period of time spent drawing on a June day. Bonnard's drawings are not to be read like photographs, but are records of their own process, of the flow of a consciousness during an unspecified period spent looking. They contain a subjectively experienced duration of time. Noodle Laban, then, is a kind of palimpsest, indexing with both lines and colours previous periods of unspecified duration that together compose the whole. It might appear to its beholder as a depiction of a perceived scene in the bathroom, but in fact it's a mingling of past images, the apparently unified perception of a single bath in a single bathroom, ultimately being nothing but a hook from which to hang previous moments. The rich accumulation of coloured marks on the surface of Noodle Laban also make the protracted time of their fabrication palpable. Bonnard's layered surfaces equally suggest how colour forms a network of complex relationships, with each new daub of colour changing the overall colour balance and calling for another one somewhere else on the canvas. Bonnard painted with a cloth in one hand and a paintbrush in the other, wiping away and adding, as if endlessly seeking a balance that's never quite achieved and instead only making things more complicated. Colour reasons with itself, he later wrote, and speaking to a journalist in the 1940s, he maintained, "I let myself go to the tyranny of colour." In terms of colour for Bonnard, the painting of process is therefore not only long, it's endless, it's without end. In Noodle Laban, then, the changing colours across its width that illuminate the length of Mart's figure and the fluctuating crisscrossing lines pertain to locate her in various stretches of past time, between sunrises and sunsets, each separated by days, months, or years. The result is a kind of failed palimpsest in which layers are not clearly distinguished from one another, indexing with both lines and colours previous periods of unspecified duration that together compose the whole. So the problem with talking about painting, and especially painting like Bonnard's, is how to make things specific. How to bring these colours, feelings, and shapes into words. How to carry these things that lie at the edge of the verbal into language. For what the painter knows, he knows in painter's terms and according to painter's ways. Yet, this is the task of the art historian, to attend to what Hans-Jörg Gadamer calls an artwork's unique mute eloquence, and interrogate it, clarify it, make its knowledge speak. To understand in words the conception of time that Bonnard's late paintings offer their viewer, an apt model might be found in the ideas of the philosopher Henri Bergson. So, I mentioned him earlier. He was really a leading figure in a reaction against mechanistic and positivist thought, and he emphasized dream and memory and creativity and the shaping of experience. That's why he was such a crucial figure in this period, and really very much part of Bonnard's generation. His thought was a likely influence on Bonnard. His ideas had substantial influence during the 1890s on a group of artists, the Nabi, of which Bonnard was part. However, what matters more here is how Bergson's writings help to explain and draw out the ideas in Bonnard's works. This isn't a case of Bonnard illustrating Bergson. Not at all. This is a case of us using Bergson to bring out the ideas in Bonnard's works. So a little bit about Bergson and how we might apply this to the painting. Just as Bonnard's Noodle Laban brings together an untold multiple of previous sketches or conscious experiences, Bergson is clear in his major 1896 work, Matter and Memory, that there's no perception that is not full of memory. Calling memory the survival of past images, Bergson claims that these images must constantly mingle with our perception of the present and may even take its place. For Bergson, perception involves the contracting together of any number of visual images from the past. In this way, the temporal structure of Noodle Laban visualizes Bergson's ideas on the structure of consciousness. For while it might appear to depict a perceived scene in the bathroom, the apparently unified perception of a single bath in a single room ultimately functions as a hook from which to hang previous moments. In this way, Bonnard's drawings act effectively like memories, the drawings in his agenda, and on scraps of paper and so on. They effectively act like memories or conscious experiences that are past, which variously mingle together in the painting where they take on life-giving colour, or in Bergson's terms, are made actual. As such, this presentation of a scene through a complex blend of past moments represents an antilinear and multifaceted time. It's an apparent present that's not just thickened by the past, but entirely occupied by it, by an untold multiple of differing durations that comprise it in various ways. There's a long-standing critical orthodoxy, as I mentioned, that Bonnard paints from memory. That is the idea that he paints particular memories. Connecting any idea of Bonnard's practice might at first, I feel I need to mention this, might at first sound like a repetition of this assumption, right? But it's not. First, Bergson's idea of memory is just not the same as this rather more Proustian memory. Proustian being kind of repository of memories by which the narrator can leave the present and reinstall himself in a particular place and time, kind of dip into his past. Rather, for Bergson, memory is basically just the same as subjective consciousness. It's only accessible when it's restored to matter by mixing with present perception. In short, for Bergson, we don't access memory, dipping into it to draw out individual images. Rather, memory all the time acts in us. So in this way, we can understand Bonnard's drawings as effectively like the memories, which mingle together in the painting where they take on colour. What is more is if, as I am suggesting, Bonnard's drawings, collected in his dated agenda and elsewhere, perform a kind of memory-like function in his painting process, then their own ontology as inscriptions of the flows of consciousness mean they're well understood in Bergsonian terms. For Bergson, memory is neither a store of pictures nor of places. He defined it most clearly in the Huxley Lecture at the University of Birmingham in 1911. Consciousness, Bergson said, is memory. So what he calls memory, really, is rather more than past recollections. It names the entire subjective share of our experience, all that which is consciousness or spirit rather than matter. It is experience duration, but that has passed, and so exists in a non-linear virtual plane. This Bergsonian notion of memory as consciousness helps us to piece together the complex temporality of Bonnard's late paintings that weren't painted from memory as the platitude goes, but painted from multiple sketches which preserve the subjective encounter with the motif and import it into the painting. On this basis, I suggest Noodle Laban is then to be read as a multifaceted accumulation of previous memories or durations, themselves collected over periods of years, comprising a deeply prolonged pictorial temporality. So, just as at this painting's centre, Mart lies in an absorptive reverie that for the beholder is effectively endless, so too at the related levels of the painterly surface and the artistic process, Bonnard's work makes visible and palpable a long, continuous duration. Not a single linear stretch of hours, but a rich multiplicity of durations, recording the consciousness of time. Hours spent in the bathroom, making drawings spread over years. Mart's bath, then, is something beyond the average everyday activity it might appear to be, being rather what might be called an ecstatic or extraordinary quotidian, as it becomes the site of an investigation into temporality, as she bathes in a pool of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. So as before, we're inviting questions from absolutely everyone, but we'll begin with the students. So do we have any questions from the students? Yes, Brad.
Thank you, Lucy. When one looks at this painting, and in terms of not just memory, as you describe it, and the passage of time, for me it raises the question of what about the future? So how does all of this project into his understanding of the future and its relationship with time, both past and present?
Thank you. That's cool. Thank Thank you. That's such an interesting question. The future. I'm so glad you asked this because this has never occurred to me. I've always thought about Bonnard in relation to the past. Can I put that on a shelf and I will come back to it? Could I possibly, I've never done this before, could I possibly take another question and then, it's really interesting. I want to let it bubble for a second. I'm going to write Brian, future. And then I'll come back to it. Okay. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, sure. Let's have another question. I mean, you can have another question yourself, or we can have one there for Emma.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it really fascinating to think about modern temporality in a completely different way, and in contrast to Cubism and Futurism, as you're talking about. So, and if I understand correctly, you're looking at his work through the lens of Bergson, but he didn't necessarily, he wasn't necessarily directly influenced by Bergson. Is that correct?
So I think he read Bergson. I'm pretty sure he read Bergson. You often read passing mention that Bonnard and the Nabi of the group he was part in the 1890s, they were really into Bergson. This is actually not very well referenced, but I have found some places. That do corroborate this. Corroborate. Have I just? Yeah. And I'm sure he did. However, I just think sometimes it's too easy as when we're doing the kind of intellectual work that we do, to assume that artists would have wanted to read a theorist, take it all on board, read it precisely, as if they were doing a philosophy MA, and then paint something to sort of illustrate it. That's all kind of. It sort of seems too easy and too much the kind of intellectual approach that we have, and I just don't believe that I don't believe that Bonnard was doing that kind of thing. I believe art itself is a form of knowledge. It's not an illustration of somebody else's knowledge. So I think that sometimes philosophical ideas can be really helpful in drawing out the ideas and putting them into words that are already there in an artwork, but that are not in verbal form. It so happens that I think there's a lot of similarities between Bonnard and Bergson's work. I also think there's something to be said for using a philosopher just as a point of or a philosophy or any other kind of text just as a point of comparison. They could be two different things. I think it does matter that Bonnard was aware of Bergson. They're coming at the same kind of problems, the same kind of questions about time. How do you react to this positivist culture of the late 19th century? How do you find space again after this overly deterministic way of thinking for dreaming and for imagination? They're coming a lot of the same problems at the same time in the same culture. But I think Bonnard does it in his own way. I think it's interesting to compare with Bergson. But I wouldn't want to push too heavily on that link, because how do we know exactly what he read? And most artists I've ever met, when they read a text, they read it in their own way. If Bonnard really read Bergson, he probably took something completely different out of it from what I've taken. We all read texts in our own way. So I really am just so cautious about any kind of idea that he was thinking too much about Bergson himself. Yeah. Not quite ready to go back to the future yet.
Alan?
First of all, thank you very much for this interesting reading of Bonnard. It seems to me you are making very strong claims for his knowledge of Bergson in terms of your analysis of the work pictorially and how it works to convey temporality in a durational manner. I'm also surprised that you haven't compared or brought forward Matisse's work as you consider these problems, because of course there's a whole school of Fauvist painting that's very much influenced by Bergson. Matisse being one of those artists. In his case, working with the evocation of rhythm and a durational unfolding of perception over time, as opposed to, say, the a cubist work, which is working again, evoking the idea of rhythm and subjective experience through an amalgamation of images, and I can see some of that kind of quality operating here. But what about the absence of these Bergsonian fauvists?
Yeah. So I think the kind of Bergsonian ideas that have been picked up on most heavily in the art history literature tend to focus on rhythm, as you suggested, rhythm and duration and certain ideas of intuition. All of that literature, and there is quite a lot of it out there on Matisse and some of it on the Nabi, has been really interesting to me and really helpful. But I think that the ideas that the ways in which I've connected Bonnard to Bergson are actually aspects of Bergson's work that hasn't necessarily been picked up on that much in the art historical literature. For example, what I was talking about today. I think that should I say more on that? For example, well, okay, I won't get too specific, but the idea of all these memories collecting together and how perception is in fact just an accumulation of memory is, I don't think, something that is talked about too much in relation to Matisse and the Nabi. You can disagree.
Yeah, I could recommend some
things
for you to look at.
An
article called Rhythms of Duration.
I know the one.
Yeah. In the Nuremberg.
I still think it's quite different, I still think it's quite different, and I think this kind of rhythmic kind of endeavour is something that's happening a little bit earlier in the 20th century, and I think that Bonnard's, and again, I just want to emphasise that I think Bonnard's doing his own thing here, and that I think it is. I think I'm using Bergson to draw out that, and I'm really not. I don't even think it's personally. I don't think that it's necessary. I think using Bergson is really helpful, but I don't think it's vital that he read Bergson. I think it's something you suggested at the beginning of your first question. Suggested that actually it's pretty necessary that he read Bergson in order to be able to paint this painting, and I personally believe that this painting came at the same time that Berg was painted, at the same kind of time, or a bit after, obviously, but same kind of time that Bergson was writing what he was writing. But that this is a discovery of what it is to watch, to draw somebody every day in an agenda, little diary that is dated. His drawings were done in a dated diary. Every drawing, most of his drawings are done on a page that actually says 27th of March, 1928. And then he collects them all up. This is his method. I don't think any artist ever changed their artistic method entirely and started drawing in an agenda as opposed to something else because they were trying to emulate a theory they read in a book. I think Bonnard could have come up... I don't think Bonnard would have painted... Basically, to put it bluntly, I think Bonnard did not need to have read Bergson to paint this painting. I think he came to his own knowledge in his own way. And it has a structural similarity that is really interesting and that Bergson helps to draw out.
So this brings forward the last question, which was, are you interpreting the work through Bergson, or are you making a claim that
I'm using Bergson. And, but because
it's important.
How have I not made the distinction clear? In what? Sorry, please. Yeah.
Well, you've introduced Henri Bergson as an important figure for interpretation.
Yeah.
And talked about his work very convincingly in those terms. And then evoked the possibility, I guess, that he was aware of Bergson. Actually talked about the Nabi as being, interested in his ideas. Acknowledged the fact that Bergson is in the general discourse in Cubism and Futurism, but also very importantly in Fauvism in the case of this artist and his style and values and use of color and so forth. And so, quite rightly, one wonders, are you reading into his work an interpretation anchored in Henri Bergson's ideas of duration and so forth, to counter an existing interpretation of him as a photographic artist? If so, and you're looking at the work visually, what's the interrelationship between your ideas and the artist's intentions?
Okay, I think this is really interesting. I mean, these are methodological questions I've asked myself a lot for the last number of years. I am reading in, I suppose. How can I not? I've read Bergson, I'm looking at Bonnard's paintings. All art history is, to an extent, a reading in, as well as a reading out. So yeah, probably I am reading in Bergson's works into these paintings. So you might say, well, why use Bergson at all? And that's a question I've asked myself. If really Bonnard's doing this work, if the knowledge is Bonnard's, why do we need Bergson? There are some reasons. I think it is okay to say these people were doing a parallel project and that this parallel brings something out, perhaps both in Bonnard and Bergson. I think it is interesting to show that there is a parallel that was also rooted in a contemporaneous time in asking the same questions. And ultimately, I think using somebody, a philosopher like Bergson, whose ideas are very well respected already as a knowledge, as philosophy, helps to draw out the solidity of the ideas that we can find in Bonnard. One could make the whole argument that I made without Bergson. I think if we're making arguments about paintings and about artists, we should find them in the paintings and in the artists. But as much as we possibly can. One could make it without Bergson, but then when you come to the part where you want to bite down on and say, look, there's knowledge here, there's ideas about time, there's a theory even of time. What is Bonnard's theory of time? You need a little bit of backing up for that. And somebody like Bergson really helps. If Bergson can have a theory of time, why can't a painter have a theory of time? Just because it's done in painters' ways and with painters' means and in painters' ways.
I'm certainly not claiming that painters don't contribute to knowledge, just to be clear.
No, I didn't take that either. But I'm just saying that's, for me, the biggest reason to draw on Bergson. Perhaps, I think, yeah.
Well, I think this was very useful, actually, in the methodological discussion, actually, to bring out some of the questions that we're dealing with at the forum, with the forum as a whole, which is, when can we ascribe an idea to an artist who might be working in an abstract way or in a painterly way? So thank you very much for this exchange. David?
Thank you. There's so much to think about, and I think this one image really exemplifies your ideas. I'm particularly interested in and perhaps I'm paraphrasing poorly, but this distinction you make between a moment of time, which is typically ascribed to an analysis of the work, versus the sort of this dreamlike continuity of memory impressions over wide swaths of time. And I'm sure you're interested in talking more about Bergson right now. I can't help but think about the movement image and Zeno's paradox that Deleuze, he spends the whole first chapter talking about, really this distinction. And I always find it very difficult to understand Deleuze, in fact, and what he's saying. Is he saying that the moment in time is valuable, or is there no such thing? It's all part of a temporal noosphere. And so this might be an easy yes or no question to answer. And you also talk about dreams, and there's certainly intimations of ideas like condensation in some of Bergson's work as well. And I'm just wondering if you had any comments or did any applications of either Deleuze or Freud even in this really clear distinction. I see both the moment and the duration, and the way you describe it, particularly in this one image, is so clear to me. And I'm just wondering if either of those bodies of theory informed your work as well.
So Bergson has been heavily read through Deleuze. Deleuze wrote a well-known book called Bergsonism, and his book has informed the way a lot of people are reading Bergson ever since. I'm not entirely alone in finding that actually this has slightly distorted our understanding of Bergson. And actually there was an article that, I can't remember when it was published, but basically said we need to stop this because it's stopping by I think John Mullicky that because Bergson focuses on the virtual and the actual Deleuze focuses on the virtual and the actual because they he uses them a lot in his own writing. And Bergson, when you read him, doesn't talk about the virtual and the actual very much at all. These words actually barely appear in Bergson. He's obsessed with, for example, ideas like free will. How often do you, when you come up, you read Bergson in art history, nobody ever talks about Bergson in relation to free will when they're talking about art history. And yet, I mean, his whole, I'm sure, but not very often. I mean, it's all about rhythm and it's often about, in kind of, sometimes it's in Deleuzean terms, but not so much. But anyway, so I've actually tried to, after spending quite a while reading Deleuze, I decided that I was doing Bergson without Deleuze. And as for Freud, not that he's not not that Deleuze is not an interesting thinker in his own right, but I was interested in historical Bergson really more than his.
With you, I might be on a small raft of people who are not entirely enchanted of Deleuze. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. As for Freud, I must admit, coming clean, I haven't applied those kinds of ideas at all. I haven't really thought about how they would relate, and I think that would be really interesting. But I haven't. I think there's so much more to be done on Bonnard, particularly in terms of the uncanny and the surreal, and that's something I really wanted to do. But a doctorate can only be so many words long. So yeah, but thank you.
Another question? Yeah, yeah, Ambrina and then James. Yeah.
So it's just a simple question, looking at the painting and how Bonnard is trying to describe the relationality of time. So we usually see time in a linear fashion and categorize it as past, present, and future. But as I see in his work, he is trying to emphasize on the entangled nature of time, that how past is connected with present and present connected with time. And as you mentioned in his diary, he takes sketches and works from memory. So in relation to that, my question is that what do you think? Bonnard was trying to capture the moment in time, or was he trying to capture the movement of time?
More the latter than the former. In short, the movement of time more than the moment. I think he's moving away from the moment. And I think he's trying to find something much more prolonged and lengthened.
In relation to the colors, if you can just elaborate on more, that he was trying to capture the movement of time, but because you talk about the colors and how it seems like she's in the bath since morning to evening or whatever, since for so many days or what. But how the color played the role in this.
Oh, how color plays
colors,
a role.
because you said he was considered as the master of color, right?
Yeah, so I think color plays a role in two ways here. The first is quite simply the colors that move across the canvas that seem to me to be readable as the sun's passage through the day. And secondly, in the way that they're blurred and layered over the top in ways that you can't quite distinguish one layer from another, such that there just seems to be a kind of endless reworking that really could and does go take the viewer back through years of its artistic process. I think those are the two main ways.
So it just seems to me that he is working from his memory, but still, as you said, that he was endlessly working and adding color to it or whatever. So I think in his view, the time which is endless and relational and with non-linear qualities, he's trying to portray that in his work.
Yeah.
So
sorry, go on.
Yeah. So I just have a question about how do you define then memory from his perspective, which is endless, and adding on to it. So it's never a memory, actually.
So how I define, I don't know if I define memory, but what I'm trying my point really is that instead of working from a memory in his head, an image in his head that he's replicating, I just don't think that's that kind of replication of a single image is going on. And in fact, there's a lot of sketches that are involved at any rate. We don't know how. We can't piece that together. But the idea of a memory and a direct mind to canvas kind of relation is almost a fallacy. And that really sketches play the role of memory, if you like. Yeah.
James and then Karun.
Thanks, Lucy. I love the way you describe the colours in this painting. And my question is to pick up from over there about colour as well, because and bringing it back to the idea of knowledge, because colour is often seen as something that's at odds with knowledge. It's partly because it's inherently unstable, partly because it's associated with surface rather than substance. Is often connected to a covering or a concealing skin over the reality of things, and partly because colour is seen as something that appeals too much to the senses and not enough to understanding. And I wonder if your interpretations of these paintings that are so filled with colour has created interpretive difficulties. Because even with this painting, you could say that perhaps the motif of the figure in the bath could be related to memory, but the colour could be operating independently. It could just be about creating a pattern or some kind of decorative elements of the different colours. So that's my question: is how it destabilizes your attempt to interpret these images.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. It's very hard to talk about colour. I think it is the hardest thing to talk about. The most interesting pieces of art historical writing on colour are generally written something along the lines of around the theme of how on earth do we talk about it, and how to go beyond just saying how do we talk about it is pretty tricky. In fact, I tried to organise a conference called Thinking Colour, because I was basically wanting to grab all the ideas I could find of people who were wanting to talk about thinking through and with colour. And it was a really interesting conference, but even that didn't give me any ideas. It did help, but I mean, it didn't. There was no goal, there was no key, there's no magic bullet for suddenly being able to talk about the unsayable, which, is pretty much tautology, really. I should have realised that. Yes, it's been a kind of constant. How do you talk about colour? He's so well known as the master of colour. Yet it's this sort of thing you have to circle around in the middle that's actually unsayable as of itself. But I think the other thing I want to say is that Bonnard also cared about colour in more simple, formalist ways. I mean, he cared about the pleasure of colour, and he cared about compositional balance, and all of this kind of thing. His jottings show this. These are perhaps less intellectual, less modern, more traditional things that are also just simply necessary for making pictures that look as compelling as they do. And it's something that I didn't write very much about, even though actually I think it was probably very much a part of historical Bonnard. Really, if you'd talked to him if you'd gone to bother him while he was making a painting with it pinned up to his wall with thumbtacks as he painted. He didn't paint with his paintings on a stretcher. I think he would have probably talked much more about colour in quite traditional ways. But it's not something that I thought about very much. But thank you.
Karun?
I have a couple of observations. The first is a question that there seems to be two options that you've presented us. One is sort of an implicit option that you discussed with me when I asked you why did you choose Bonnard, and that's to look at this as a sort of chunk of his soul, some sort of reverie, an ecstasy, some kind of sensual experience that either he's experiencing through witnessing his wife, or he's trying to access within himself, and in a experiment, sort of an inner kind of spiritual experiment, capture and convey, or maybe just capture for himself this particular emotional state of reverie, of ecstasy, of some kind of languid sensuality. And it strikes me that that is quite a compelling option. And the thing that comes to mind from my experience with Jeffrey over about 10 years is he spoke of these moments of perfection, that art kind of exists in these moments of perfection. And I look at this and I look at it as sort of an eternity. So when you talk about long duration, what springs to my mind is these are moments of perfection that are actually out of time, and they're actually little eternities, where it doesn't matter whether your life has 10 of these moments or 2 or 25, and it doesn't matter how long they last, because they are themselves eternal moments. So that's the spiritual interpretation that I would offer as one alternative. The other alternative would be, do you think it's more of an intellectual exercise? He's really looking at this as a visual way to work through a perceptual exploration of his own consciousness. So that's a sort of second option. So point number one. Point number two is, you haven't talked a lot about space. In one of his sketches, he sketched a room in which there was clearly a third dimension, a spatial dimension. This one is a lot more fabric-like, a lot more flat, in which the sides of the bathtub meld with the walls, in which it's almost the patterns sort of continue through the whole picture. There's the warp and weft kind of element of it. The bathtub seems to be twisted in space. I'm wondering if because in the article that you gave us, there was this emphasis on no gaps and the sort of fabric of the painting being very important, of sort of this seamless picture. Whether you could say some more about space, and whether you could speak to whether you think this is an intellectual or a spiritual form of knowledge that he was trying to go for.
Okay. I'll try to answer the first question first, but be very quick. I'm sorry, but I hope I'm not being too quick. I don't mean to not do justice to it, but I'd love to talk more about space, so I'm saving my time. So to answer the first, I think it's both intellectual and to do with reverie and moments of time and timelessness and eternity and all of these kinds of things that you were talking about. Basically, one or the other, both. I think the difficult thing is to be able to talk about it talk about Bonnard's works in ways that do justice to the both. And to not make him seem like an intellectual, because he wasn't, he was a painter. And to also not fail to do justice to the intellectual work that art does. The problem is always finding ways to do both. But the second, space, I wish I'd talked about space. I'm sorry I didn't talk more about space, because I think space is really fascinating. Obviously, I mean, simply looking at this painting, you can imagine that it was painted, pinned up with thumbtacks and probably crumpled and that probably has something to do with this kind of spatial deformation that you see. So there are a few things to say here. Absolutely, it looks like a flat tapestry. This idea of the decorative, the all-over tapestry-like surface is very important and goes back to Bonnard's early days, or earlier career in the 1890s. When the idea of painting a thoroughly covered surface that the eye can flow over quite seamlessly is very important, and I think that's basically a principle that he never loses, and that remains fundamental to his work. The other thing main thing I want to say is that these deformations, which are also actually something that go back to 1890s thinking, also have a lot to do with time. That space and time aren't completely inextricable here, because these spatial deformations register subjectivity. They register subjective seeing. The fact that you are not simply a recording device. And because I don't think, so Jean Claire's article that you may have read, I think tries to find too much of personally, it's a great article, but I think there's a temptation I feel myself, to find too much of a pattern in these spatial twistings and deformations, and to say, oh, therefore he was painting 280 degrees or something. Having looked at the paintings and having looked at the spaces where he was painting them, there's no particular thing there's no particular function or formula, if you like, that he's putting space through. It's more subjective. It's more of a... Sorry, you did.
The space stays the same, though, throughout time, right? It's not like he's painting shifting spaces. It's sort of an overlay in this one space.
Yeah,
right?
I think it does shift a little bit, in the sense, like here, the end of the bath kind of falls open, whereas at the other end, it's fairly tight. The tiles are kind of undulous. The floor doesn't quite make sense at every spot, but not in always the same way. And when you compare it with the other paintings of the bathtub or of any other subject, there's no very simple way to go, oh, he's done this to space, this, and this, and he does it in every picture. He does weird things to space, weird things that are different in every picture. And I think this goes back to a very important tradition that he's part of subjective, of deformation, distortion, which proves the subjectivity of the artist.
Yeah, that's what I was
and
gonna
there's been some really good work written about this.
Well, it also, with the fact that it's kind of like a hanging
yeah.
tapestry in your perception, it really emphasizes that this is an image hanging there, not a...
Yeah.
We're not looking into the bathroom, we're looking at something on a surface.
Yes.
And it's really clearly, another object, not we're just representing something objectively.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the subjectivity thing does relate to time as well, because it's something viewed through the lens of a person, a lens of a life, of a long period of time, and of a real human eye and a real human hand, and nothing photographic at all.
So can I
Sorry.
just jump in there? Just
Probably giving really long
I'll
answers.
take the privilege of the final question, but then we'll come back to the future. Maybe this is a key, but we're talking about, does it matter that it's the artist's wife rather than, say, an apple? So I just kind of wanted to bring in, we're talking about subjectivity and subjective experience of time, and perhaps to relate to Brian's suggestion about the future, that they are in their 60s, that they're here in this bath, they've gone through one war, they're about to go through another war. Well, I don't know, my question is about sort of the subjective link to the person in the painting. And Brian's was about the future. You can pick either of them, or you can link them up as you like.
Okay. If I talk about his wife, I'll talk forever. I mean, it does matter. She was his wife. They met in 1893. She's the model that he uses in a vast number of his pictures, but not in absolutely all of them. And he goes on to paint her in other paintings after her death in 1942 even. So that has something to do with what I was arguing. And I think what's interesting is that everyone all the time says that Bonnard's wife never ages. To me, she does age. This is not, he does not, this one's not so clear, but actually, there, I mean, it's not a peachy teenage body. And I think she gets older, and I think her aging has to do with time, and you sense a length of duration in there as well, and also, in fact, in the way that he's painting her, which is neither quite voyeuristic nor completely objective, and more the sense that actually you feel the artist, not so much in this painting as in others, but you feel the artist's presence and that she's in the bathroom, and you sense that this is a personal relationship. Because you sense the artist there, and you sense this woman, but who doesn't seem that bothered by his presence. And so you kind of know the relationship between them a little bit, even though you don't know, even if you weren't told this was his wife. And so I think that adds to I'm trying to link it all back to time, but which is not my only thing I have to say about Bonnard. And then to talk about the future very briefly. Sorry, I hope I haven't talked forever this morning. I still think it's a really wonderful question, and I don't have a great answer to it. But I think he cared about the future in practical ways. In terms of the paintings, I'm not sure how I could distinguish past from future when I'm looking at them. But he cared about younger artists. He was good friends with some Polish artists towards the end of his life. He had a young woman come and he gave her painting lessons. So I think he cared about the future. There's a quote that he has rumoured to have said he wanted to enter the year 2000 on the wings of a butterfly. I've never found a decent enough provenance of that quote, but I want it to be true.
That's a great quote to end. So thank you very much, Lucy.